I think everybody here knows me, so we're going to skip all that other stuff. This is the Culminating exhibition for my Bachelor of Fine Arts degree. The title is Obsession and Anxiety. And usually the BFA students don't really give a talk to discuss their work. It's not part of the trajectory within the BFA requirement, but part of the reason why I'm doing it is because I'm also getting a degree in art history, and so for professional development purposes, it makes a lot of sense for me to talk about my work and get that kind of experience in addition to having had the exhibition. So a lot of this work I think can be difficult to approach if you don't necessarily know what you're looking at, so I would like to open the discussion by talking about abstract expressionism. I'm going to go ahead and assume that just about everybody in this room has heard of Jackson Pollock. Is that accurate, fair? Like, if you only know one artist, he's one of the ones you might know. He did the big paintings on the floor with the drips and the action and the drunken, pissed off kind of aesthetic. That's commonly referred to as process art, and that's kind of the process that I've stolen and used to make my work here. And this work's abstract expressionism really started in the 30s and 40s with Jackson Pollock, but it evolved all through up until the 60s. And the purpose of process art was to not necessarily plan an aesthetic that you wanted to achieve, but rather have the end result be a reference for the product of the process of its making, where the end result is just a record of what's happened. And that's what I've tried to do with this work here. So Pollock was essentially the person who started it, but for this work I've been looking more at Helen Frankenthaler, who I felt had a more contemplative approach to it, where Pollock would really just throw it on the floor and attack it and just go at it. Frankenthaler she wasn't necessarily planning what she was doing, but she was a lot more cognizant of what she was doing as she was doing it. So the marks that she was getting are there's a lot more washes, it's a lot more manipulation on part of the marks that were there. And so in essence, it's her aesthetic that I'm trying to borrow and trying to own as the aesthetic that I'm employing for this kind of process. And the difference I think here is that whatever her intentions were, I'm kind of more interested in investigating how the mind works. So for the process part of it, what I'm doing is, for the paper pieces, I'm taking paper, I'm soaking it, and I'm going out with an acetylene torch to get this surface built up that I can then choose to erase, or I can choose to go over it more, or I can leave it alone and start going at it with the text. One of Frankenthaler's predecessors, Carolee Schneemann, she started doing abstract expressionism in the 60s, and what she did differently was she started incorporating sculptural aspects into her work as what art historians might call signifiers. And I'll explain more about signifiers and their significance later, but her inclusion of these sculptural elements was intended to give the viewer something more concrete to grab into when they were looking at these large abstract works that otherwise may not have any literal entrance into the work. So what Schneemann ended up concluding in the 60s as she was doing these paintings, there's a really popular theory in our history that Pollock killed painting by putting the canvas on the floor. And what Schneemann ended up concluding was that painting wasn't a useful visual language for her to use in order to make her point. So she ended up moving on to performance art. What I propose instead, by using her signifiers and using my own signifiers, I'm actually able to employ the abstract language to say something without getting away from the essence of making things and making art and making paintings. So at this point, I would like to talk a little bit more about the text. My work uses a lot of what I call semiotics and what art history calls semiotics. Semiotics essentially is the study of meaning making. So if you think about the color black, there's nothing about the word black that inherently references the color itself. It's a construct, it's artificial. All language essentially is. There's no word that sounds like the thing that it is. That's all made up as we go along. And so when you think about all these words that we have, our entire language is based around arbitration. It's all completely fabricated as we go along. And so we end up with things like black that started out as a word for a color, but then it ends up taking on all these other connotations that then are not necessarily in reference to the color itself, but cultural constructs as that word gets employed to describe things metaphorically and then later more literally, if that makes sense. Is everybody still on the same page with me?
Yeah.
Okay. And so for this work, rather than move on to performance and disavow painting entirely, I started using signifiers, which is like the word black, to act as the signified, which is what it ends up meaning when it's recontextualized in something like this. So the most obvious signifier in the room is probably the brown paper bag. When I did that, I asked 20 people what they thought of when you look at a brown paper bag with eyeballs cut out. And of those 20 people, I got about 40 to 50 different responses. So we have this innocuous brown paper bag that by itself doesn't mean anything, but the context that people bring to it is what lends it meaning. And so what I've tried to do here is examine the way that the mind functions by using these different signifiers to indicate something more about obsession and anxiety. So that's one type of sign in the signifier. The other thing I'm doing here with the process art is I am trying to not lose my place. The words themselves are part of the process as well. Like I'm not using any specific script. Like if I wanted you all to be able to read it, I would have typed it up maybe written a book instead. But instead I'm doing this mark over and over again. And so it starts to read as a couple of different things. One, it starts to read as an aesthetic choice, where making this mark over and over again starts to read like a texture on the paper. But the mark itself starts to become more important than the words that it says. The words themselves, I've often gone out of my way to make deliberately difficult to read. Degrees of legibility are really important in this work because for every word that you can read, there's dozens of others that you can't. And so the narrative that you're able to construct by interfacing with the work is completely contingent upon your experiences and what you bring to the table. And so process for me became more about, oh, hi Latoya, hey. I was saying something incredibly brilliant, I promise. Process for me is not merely about getting this palpable end result that is a result of the actions that I've inscribed upon the surface of whatever I'm doing, but also about something cognitive. There's an illusion here, an extended metaphor referring to cognition. And when you think about something, the way you think about it and the way you say it, they don't always necessarily translate. And that's really what I'm trying to get at with this work, and describing and explaining this process, and the history of that process that then is imbued within the surface of the work. The glass pieces have something similar done to them, where I've written all over the surface of the glass, but then in the firing process, which I have very little control over, it recombines the information into something that's illegible, but all the information is still essentially intact, even if you can't read it. So that's a different kind of mark making, where although the paper pieces have this, not necessarily they have a kind of a chronological history to them, kind of a chronological composite of everything that's happened. All the paper, you'll notice, is incredibly irregular. It's warped, it's bent, in places it's completely creased, in places there are holes blown in it where I tried to erase my drawing. But on the glass, rather than being a chronological composite, it is a volumetric composite of information. So different kinds of this obsessive collection of information, where in the glass I can't necessarily erase it, but I've obfuscated the information. So just to try to distill everything that I just said down into something a little bit more approachable, I'm using process art to kind of examine the way that the mind works through the lens of obsession and anxiety. And I would like to kind of end on a note. I mentioned before that I've done a lot of art history in this department. I'm getting my other degree in that. And one of the most interesting things I heard in any of the classes I took was something that Meyer Shapiro said about abstract art. The more abstract something gets, the less of a lead-in you have into the work. So if you want to really understand abstract art, you have to learn to speak its language as you connect with it. The meaning doesn't happen on the surface of the work, it doesn't happen in your mind, it happens in the space in between. And so if you really want to get at abstract art, like I said, you have to learn to speak its language. And I started taking that quite literally by giving the viewer some language to recombine into something different while they have a dialogue with this work. And so I think, there's always this debate about, do you want your viewer to take something specific away from it? Do you not care? As a faithful daughter of semiotics, I tend to fall into the camp of, that's the viewer's interaction with the work is not something I can control for, so I'm not always necessarily interested in controlling it, but I wanted really to offer the viewer an insight not only into my own mind, but into theirs as well, by offering them this dissected landscape of the mind and this metaphorical representation of cognition. And thus concludes my super awesome brilliant talk about all the stuff that I made in here.